to
try to...
consent the quorum call be suspended.
We're not in a quorum call.
I ask consent to
Senator's recognized.
speak in morning business. Mr. President, I think we should be honest with ourselves, with the people around the world, and present the reality of what Iran is today. Iran pursues a host of dangerous activities around the world that threaten the United States, its interest, and its allies. It is fomenting a proxy war in Yemen. It supports Hezbollah and Hamas. It appears to be using its foothold in Syria to test Israel's defenses. And in tragic irony, Iran supports the Syrian butcher, Bashar al-Assad, who has stooped to using chemical weapons and barrel bombs to kill his own people. How a regime like the Iranian regime, whose own people suffered under heinous chemical attacks from Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War, can stand behind Assad in Syria is incredible. But having said that, we entered into an agreement with Iran to stop them from developing a nuclear weapon. Despite all these other challenges, all the differences that we've had, continue to have with Iran, we said that gathering together with allies around the world, we wanted to make certain that Iran did not develop a nuclear weapon. And so there were lengthy agreements, lengthy negotiations and agreements, which led to the nuclear agreement with Iran to stop their development of nuclear weapons. I think it was a critically important step forward, not just because Iran with a nuclear weapon would be a danger to Israel in the Middle East, but to the world. It was that agreement which I supported and was overwhelmingly supported by Democrats in the Senate when President Obama negotiated it. The Republicans opposed it. The candidate for president on the Republican side, Mr. Trump, said that it was a terrible agreement and that he thought we should never have entered into it, and he had all sorts of derogatory things to say about this Iran nuclear agreement. But the fact of the matter is that agreement went in place and was implemented. International inspectors were sent into Iran, and those inspectors enforced that agreement and have reported to the United States and personally to members of the United States Senate, including myself, repeatedly, that Iran is complying with the terms of this agreement and is not developing a nuclear weapon. For all of the differences which we have with Iran, the facts and the evidence are clear. They were living up to the terms of this nuclear agreement so that they would not develop a nuclear weapon and threaten Israel and that region of the world. Despite that, despite the progress made by this agreement, today, President Trump has announced his decision to halt the waiver of sanctions related to Iran and this nuclear agreement. In essence, to step away from this agreement and to say that the United States will no longer be party to it. That agreement, that nuclear agreement with Iran, removed the threat of nuclear weapons being used to pursue destabilizing Iranian activities. Just imagine how hard and difficult it would be to push back on Iranian aggression if, in fact, they had a nuclear weapon. The purpose of this agreement was to avoid that possibility, the very agreement which President Trump walked away from today. Instead, because of this agreement, Iran's nuclear weapon program has been stopped in its tracks. In fact, you have to go back over 10 years to find any plans being made in Iran in the past to even consider it, and this agreement was working. International inspectors have unprecedented access to Iran to watch for cheating, and Iran does not have a nuclear weapon or quick breakout ability to make one. These are real accomplishments toward world peace. Mr. President, we live in a dangerous world. President Trump's decision today will make it more dangerous. By eliminating the United States' participation in this agreement to stop a development of nuclear weapons in Iran, we run the real possibility that terrible things will follow, terrible things that will cost human life and cause even more misery around this world. Let's be clear. That agreement clearly states, and I quote, "Iran reaffirms that under no circumstances will Iran ever seek, develop, or acquire any nuclear weapon." End of quote. That is an unequivocal statement. And to ensure that Iran never does, this agreement provided for ongoing inspections by the International Atomic Energy Agency. They weren't just inspecting the obvious places. They were inspecting the entire supply chain that Iran would have to turn to develop a nuclear weapon. Ernest Moniz was Secretary of Energy under President Obama. He's a physicist by training. He's received global recognition for his expertise. He sat at the table because he knew what it takes to develop a nuclear weapon, and he put into this agreement, which President Trump is walking away from today, the kind of access for inspection that gives us the assurance that Iran cannot cheat. And if they tried, we'd catch them. Anyone arguing that Iran is allowed to build a nuclear bomb under this agreement after a certain period is simply wrong and misleading the American people. I have met with the IAEA's Director General, Amano, several times. Each time, I was very blunt and direct with him. Tell me what your experience has been in Iran. Tell me if your inspectors wanted to go through a certain door, inspect a certain installation, go inside a certain facility. Were you stopped by Iran? What he told me was if we were stopped and protested, they opened the door. We have never had a failure of access. That's what he told me repeatedly, over and over again. He told me repeatedly, and he said the same thing to Democratic senators that he spoke with, that Iran was in compliance with this nuclear agreement and that the inspectors by IAEA are able to resolve any areas where they contested and said we should have access. They were given access. I hope President Trump will actually read this agreement. I wish he would have sat down and spent a few minutes with Inspector Amano before making this fateful decision today. Mr. President, I know it's probably good political theater for some to blast any international agreement or related effort that was taken up by President Obama. But let me remind my colleagues of other negotiations undertaken with troubling regimes that served our national security interest. It was President John Kennedy who negotiated with the Soviets during the Cuban Missile Crisis, bringing us back from the brink of nuclear war. It was President Richard Nixon who negotiated with the Chinese on normalizing relations, even while that communist regime was providing weapons to the North Vietnamese who were fighting our soldiers. And of course, who can forget that it was President Ronald Reagan who negotiated with the Soviets while that communist nation had thousands of nuclear warheads pointed at the United States of America. They were occupying Eastern Europe, and they were supporting troubling regimes around the world, and yet President Reagan sat down and negotiated with them. Let us recall how many on the right of the political spectrum savaged then President Reagan for negotiating with the Soviets on nuclear arms reduction. Let me read an excerpt from the January 17, 1988 New York Times about the opposition President Ronald Reagan faced in negotiating an arms agreement with the Soviets. Criticism eerily familiar to what we've been hearing today from President Trump. Here's what they said about President Reagan. Already, right-wing groups have mounted a strong campaign against the INF Treaty. They've mailed out close to 300,000 letters opposing it. They've circulated 5,000 cassette recordings of General Bernard Rogers, former Supreme Commander of NATO, attacking it. And finally, they're preparing to run newspaper ads against President Reagan, savaging him as a new Neville Chamberlain for signing an accord with Hitler of his day and gullibly predicting peace for our time. The Conservative National Review's May 22, 1987 edition had the following cover title, Reagan's Suicide Pact. While opposed by some at the time, I doubt few in this chamber on either side of the aisle would look back today and say that President Reagan's negotiations with the Soviets or the eventual agreement wasn't in the best interest of America's national security. So here we are today, Mr. President. President Trump plunging us and our allies into uncertainty when it comes to the Iranian nuclear weapon and the credibility of America's word around the world. It's not very good timing, if we seriously hope to bring peace to the Korean Peninsula by putting the American signature and name on the line in a negotiation to stop the development of nuclear weapons on that area of the world. What will President Trump do if Iran restarts its nuclear weapon program? Is he prepared to face the prospects of another war in the Middle East, a war with nuclear weapons? Certainly we'll have no inspectors there anymore if President Trump has his way, and that can only set us back and open the possibility of a nuclear Iran in the future. Does that make America safer? Does that make the world safer? Of course not. Is this just about undoing what President Obama did, keeping some campaign promise, which frankly doesn't serve the best interest of peace in the world or our own national security? So, Mr. Trump and my colleagues on the other side of the aisle who support this move and are unwilling to speak against it, the situation they are creating by walking away from this nuclear agreement with Iran is now in your hands, on your watch. I hope something good can come from this. By all accounts, the American people overwhelmingly oppose what President Trump did today. The American people know we live in a dangerous world. They've heard over and over again about the prospects of a nuclear attack from North Korea. The notion that Iran would now develop a nuclear weapon does not make America feel any safer. And by a margin of 2-1, they tell President Trump what you announced today was wrong. It does not make us any safer. Mr. President, there have been many opportunities in this country to work together on a bipartisan basis in foreign policy. Historically, that was almost always the case, as it should be. But those days, sadly, are behind us. Instead, now, it's strict partisanship. If President Obama wanted it, President Trump has to oppose it. Look at nuclear, or the decision on the Paris Climate Agreement. That was an agreement reached by every nation in the world, and President Trump stepped away from it, saying when it comes to climate change, the United States does not want to engage in this global conversation. When it came to health care in the United States, President Trump said, I want to eliminate Obamacare, eliminate the Affordable Care Act. We're seeing now across the United States dramatic increases in health insurance premiums because of President Trump's decision and the opposition by members of Congress and the Republican side against the Affordable Care Act. But now we are walking into a new territory. It's not just climate change. It's not health care. It's the safety of this world. It's a question about whether another nation will join the nuclear club, a nation which we have plenty of differences with. We had an agreement, a good one. It was brokered by a group of nations that were unlikely allies: China, Russia, Western European nations, and the United States. Of course, that's an unusual grouping. But they all agreed that Iran should not have a nuclear weapon. And we moved forward today with an agreement that was working until this president, just 2 hours ago, came before the American people and said the United States is walking away from that agreement. Sadly, it is a reckless decision. It is an historic, tragic, reckless decision which runs the risk of allowing this country to develop, Iran to develop a nuclear weapon, threaten the region, and threaten the world. We live in a dangerous world, and we need a president who understands it. Mr. President, I yield.